Hello and welcome to another video on TCGplayer.com. I'm Steve Rubin playing 5-color humans this week in Modern, a deck that has been seeing a lot of play in Modern actually. It started off as a deck that Collins Mullen won a SCG Open with, and then the very next week, a friend of mine, Matt Ling, actually won the Star City Classic. So it kind of won back-to-back tournaments, in spite not really being a deck that probably more than like one or two people were playing. It's new because of some of the cards in the new set Ixalan. It's got Kitesail Freebooter, which looks like a kind of not the most powerful card, but that in the combination with Unclaimed Territory, like another Cavern of Souls, kind of allowed you to play this all the humans you ever wanted shell. And Freebooter gives a deck that is normally, just a linear aggressive deck, a decent amount of disruption, which is important in Modern. I always talk about in my articles how you need to be able to combat unfair decks or be unfair yourself in a way. And Kitesail Freebooter is definitely good disruption. And kind of the reason this deck came together. Before Kitesail Freebooter, this deck wasn't really a deck. Now you can kind of curve out aggressively, disrupt your opponent, and hit their hand and not die to their combos or their board sweepers and such. So let's just talk about the mana base. So you have 4 Ancient Ziggurats, which are pretty hindering because it allows they don't cast spells, so it kind of makes it so that you can't play that many spells in your deck. Just off the fact that even if I put like a card like Stony Silence, I see some people playing this deck in your sideboard. If you have an Ancient Ziggurat, you can't even tap that for mana. So it's kind of a situation where you want to play a lot of creatures, and even at the Open that this deck first broke out at, it was kind of almost a joke that Collins played 36 creatures in the main, and his sideboard was just 15 more creatures, and I kind of feel as if that's, obviously, it works because some of your creatures are actually spells, like Reflector Mage and Kitesail Freebooter, but it's just kind of a funny thing that you can't play that many spells in your deck, so you're forced to play, 37 creatures. Cavern of Souls, obviously, your best land. It not only can cast Ether Vial, but it helps you cast all the colored creatures in your deck and makes them uncounterable. Horizon Canopy, this is kind of the innovation of Matt Ling, who played the deck the next week and has been playing it for several weeks, where you don't play the fetch shock mana base because you don't have that many. Like, putting in all those fetches just to stretch those shocks means you're dealing yourself like 3 to 5 damage over the course of the game. It's a little bit better just to play the Horizon Canopies. They make you a little bit worse at casting Mantas Rider, but it's a really nice tool to not only reduce the damage you take overall from your lands, but give you late game, give you the ability to not flood out because some of your lands draw you cards. 1 plains, just in there in case you get Ghost Courted or Path to Exiled. It's the most commonly used source in the deck, so you want 1 plains. 2 Seachrome Coast. This is just kind of instead of Hallowed Fountain, instead of Windswept Heath, we're playing these. They cast a lot of your early game spells, and this version deck has Phantasmal Image, which is why you play 2 Seachrome Coast and no Thickets. And Unclaimed Territory, just another mana source for humans. Now, 12 1-drops. You have 4 Champion of the Parish, 4 Noble Hierarch, 4 Ether Vial. This deck is kind of slow if you don't have a 1-drop, so generally you want to not keep hands without 1-drops, unless you have a pretty cohesive hand and the matchup. Champion is just kind of your reason this deck exists, because it gives you this 1-drop that, if goes unanswered, snowballs the game, becomes really big, and is just a huge threat. Noble Hierarch, very similar to Champion. It's just, these cards are just so insane on turn 1. Lets you cast 2 spells in 1 turn, fixes your mana, gives you Exalted while it lets you ramp. Ether Vial is the worst 1-drop, and is the kind of card that some people are like, well, I don't know if this deck should play Ether Vial. And in my experience, it's not great, but it's part of the mana base, because you can't really cast your spells with a huge amount of reliability, because you're playing 5 colors, you're playing all these like Mantas Rider and Reflector Mage. Obviously, your lands do tap for good colors, but the ability to just not have any awkwardness, Ether Vial puts anything into play, lets you play a little bit of instant speed with cards like Kitesail Freebooter and Reflector Mage, which is nice. And it's just kind of like your filler. It gives you more plays on turn 1. and lets you also play less lands. Like only playing 19 lands, you pretty much play Vials instead because they almost act as multiple lands, right? They tap for multiple mana like pretty much every turn. So that's why you have the Vials. Fourth, Thalia. There's a lot of pretty much every independent human is kind of important to this deck. Like, you cut one of them and the deck kind of falls apart. Thalia is what makes this deck awesome because, like we said before, you can't really play spells in this deck. And there's a lot of decks I've played in the past that have had Thalia in them, but still had, like, Path to Exile, or maybe cards like Stony Silence, or, like, Equipment, or whatever it is. And Thalia is always awkward. And yeah, you have the Ether Vial, but in general, the Thalia is never awkward for you at all, and is just kind of crippling for your opponent while allowing you to kind of do your thing. And I think that it is very, very pivotal to the strategy because it lets you beat... It's good against pretty much every deck. Even the other fair decks it's good against. So Thalia is awesome. Obviously, a decent body as well. Thalia's Lieutenant is just another champion that but pumps your team, so it gives you... not versatility, so to speak, but lets you kind of overpower people. A pretty straightforward threat there. Is kind of like your lord of the deck. 3 Phantasmal Image, so a lot of people play Mayor of Averbrook, but Sam Pardee did well at a Moto Challenge playing 3 Phantasmal Image instead of Mayor of Averbrook. And the idea here is that Mayor is like good when you have a lot of stuff in play already. And in those situations, Image is good as well. And a lot of the times, like instead of pumping your Mantas Rider, you know, or pumping your Thalia's Lieutenant, you'd rather just have another Rider or another Lieutenant. Or, so in the aggressive games, it's very similar to Mayor because it lets you kind of make your best threats. But in the games where you want to be disruptive, Mayor doesn't really put a fast clock on your opponent. Like, obviously on the last turn, it deals them a lot of damage. But the Phantasmal Images actually give you more disruption. So, for instance, against any combo decks or control decks, you can just copy Freebooter or copy Meddling Mage and really cut down, gives you additional copies of those cards, so to speak, and you can really cut down on your opponent's options. 1 Dark Confidant, this is kind of, you know, a weird card to have, but it is just an awesome Magic card. Obviously, it's not necessarily synergizing with your plan, but it does give you a threat that can create card advantage and dig you deeper. So if it's not doing anything in particular, it can find your other cards, which is good. And against a lot of control decks, you know, if you can stick a Dark Confidant, you can run away with the game. For Freebooters, we talked about this before, it's just your Thoughtseize. It's your ability to kind of go in the air as well. If you have Exalted or Thalia's Lieutenant, you can go in the air with Freebooter and even Mantas Rider. And the flying is definitely not something to disregard. And just disrupts pretty much every deck in Modern, so it's pretty awesome. Meddling Mage, very good against some combo decks. Obviously pretty narrow in some matchups where, you know, they're too fast or they have a lot of different ways of removing it. But is the kind of card that can shut down some of the really powerful decks of Modern. We're talking about like Primeval Titan decks. We're talking about Storm. You can shut off their Pass and Flames or their Grape Shot. Sometimes Grape Shot game 1 just makes sure they can't win because they don't play any other Storm cards or removal in game 1. If you play against pretty much any combo deck, you know, you can just kind of work on their combo pieces and make it sure that they can't combo you as easily. 4 Reflector Mage, banned in Standard, just an awesome card. I'm choosing to play the 4th one over the 2nd Thalia just because I want to win those creature matchups. And having multiple Reflector Mages, they kind of synergize with each other because they can kind of lock your opponent out for a longer period of time. 4 Mantas Rider. This card is the card that when I first saw the deck, I was like, really? This deck's splashing for Mantas Rider? That doesn't make any sense. But it's not a true splash, and Mantas Rider is just insane. It comes down. It's really fast. It hits hard. It has evasion. Just the fact that it doesn't really... Not that it doesn't hurt your mana, but it's just not very expensive for an awesome threat, especially when people are taking a bunch of damage from their lands. So Mantas Rider is awesome. Thalia, Heretic, Cathar gives you just a little bit of disruption and something really nice to kind of play on turn 2 with Noble Hierarch to cut off fetches. Let's move to the sideboard. So we have a bunch of creatures here. Let's go over the creatures first. We have 2 Mirran Crusaders. These are just for green-black decks, Tarmogoyf decks. Any control decks when you might have some dead cards like Reflector Mage. 2 Sin Collector. This is for Storm, spell combo decks, you know, any kind of ad nauseum, living end kind of situation, but also doubles as a reasonable card against like Jeskai type control decks. Not green-black, but ones that are like Snapcaster Cryptic heavy. Dark Confidant, another way of grinding, pretty straightforward. 2 Staticasters. These are for your affinity decks, poison decks, any type of token strategy, obviously, you'll be bringing it in. Just a pretty solid card. It's also there for Storm, because you have a lot of disruption for Storm, and a lot of the times they try to empty the Warrens you out, so you are forced to side in as a Staticaster. 2 Vithian Renegades. This is so that you can kill Ensnaring Bridge, so you can kill Cranioplating. Pretty straightforward. You know, you side this in against Tron, just to maybe Mise a map or an Oblivion Stone or something. 2 Restoration Angels. This is kind of... I'm playing these instead of the Anafenzas, because I see people play Anafenza as a kind of, like... They play it so that when they're playing against an Anger of the Gods or a Lightning Bolt deck, they board that in. The Anafenza's Graveyard Clause really isn't that relevant against many decks. I think that while it's not a human, I think that Restoration Angel is just a little bit more effective. It gives you a little bit of instant speed play, gives you a little synergy with Reflector Mage if you're going that way, and Anafenza just never really seemed that potent to me. So it's just basically just a 4 toughness creature that you board in those kind of really grindy Lightning Bolt matchups. 2 Dismember. This is just in case you play a Mirror, in case you play against any sort of really fast creature deck. Not a burn deck, but maybe a zoo deck or a deck that's trying to like kill you with, I guess, affinity. You can kill their Steel Overseers, or if you're playing against an infect deck, it just gives you an actual spell, so you can have removal. It's kind of weird because in this deck, I don't think you side it in as often. Obviously, if you're playing against any sort of Tarmogoyf Dark Confidant deck, it's awesome. But it's just in there to give you some removal. 2 Grafdigger's Cage is mostly for company decks, but not just like green-white company, but Chord company decks. Pretty much, you know, any deck that's trying to devote a Druid company you out, and also, of course, any degenerate graveyard deck like Dredge or Goryo's Vengeance. So that's the deck tech, and let's get into round 1.